I don't know if you were aware, but Richard Branson sent his first rocket up into space for space tourists. And the verdict from the space tourist who had, I think, it was an older chap, he had a bit of Parkinson's, but he's made his money, he's done all right for himself, and he was in an amazing ship, and he was having this amazing experience, and he said, as he looked at the earth from space, I am truly humbled. The earth speaks. It wows us with its beauty. It humbles us with its might. It intrigues us with its mystery. We see it aching, and it calls out to us. It says, I'm not well, or I'm doing great. We've never, ever had, I don't think, so much capacity to learn about it, to experience it, to understand it. And we've never had so much need, you could say, to be attentive to it, to want to hear what it's got to say. And yet, what do we say? What do we know about human beings? We're having a real job listening to it. We tell that to each other. We know that about ourselves. We don't hear it. We don't hear what it says. I was away at a Christian conference 2 weeks ago, and I heard an Old Testament scholar called Ivor Pubelan. He's an Old Testament expert, particularly an expert on the book of Genesis. He taught fantastically about particularly 1 and 2 Genesis, and he said something that, I'd heard a lot. Some of you were there. I'd heard a lot, and he said one thing in particular that really struck me. God speaks to us in two. It was really great, grabbing hold of the whole crowd, 2,000 people. God speaks to us in 2 ways. He speaks to us through His Word and through His works. This is what he says. Old Testament scholar, God speaks to us through His Word. The Bible made flesh in Jesus Christ, and through His works, all of the things that He's doing, His works, His created works, and the development of that created works. Romans 1, verse 20, I think we can put it up on the screen. If you're thinking, is he right? For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen. This is Paul. Paul can really, if you want something put concise, Paul's one of the guys to go to that for. Being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. What does that say? What does that say about the earth speaking? What does that say about the earth speaking and us grasping who God is? For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, the mystery of God, His eternal power and His divine nature have been clearly seen. Where? Being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Psalm 19, and we could have read all of this psalm. Indeed, we could have read from many psalms. It's one of the main features of the psalm. They tell us, they sing to us, the earth speaks of God. This is just a glimpse as you look up. I don't know if you saw the meteor shower last night. We had a stab at it, me and my girls, in the back garden. It was amazing. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of His hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from them, yet their voice goes out into all the earth. Their words to the end of the world. The earth speaks to us, and it speaks to us, so God's word says, so I would affirm, about Him. It sings out to us about a higher power. It screams it to us in His creation. One of the questions that we ask as human beings, one of the obstacles to faith often that we say is, if God would just speak, why doesn't God speak? Why doesn't He show Himself? Why doesn't He speak? If He would only speak, that's what we say up to God. And God says back down to us, here's how I speak. Here's how I speak if you would only listen. If you would only listen and hear my words. So we're going to fire through Psalm 65, and we're going to see a few ways that God's people see the way that He speaks and what He has to say to them. And it's like 3 simple things. And I am preaching this as I read the newspaper. You'll notice that if you've got a Bible in front of you, if you're doing that, or if you're on your phone, you'll also notice it on the text. I read the newspaper back to front, start with the sport and work my way back through to the front. I'm preaching it this way because I think that the high point, the thing that I really want you to take home and go home with, is in the first verse. But you'll only find that if you've got a device. You'll have to start with us at the back. The first thing I think we learn from this psalm, and it's not Psalm 23, it's Psalm 65, is that God is behind it. Creation. The first thing these people realize is that God is behind it, and they are reassured. God's behind it, and to know that is to be reassured. God's behind the creation, it's reassuring. This psalm and the book of Psalms, in fact, the Bible, generally, is not a science book for skeptics. Sometimes we come to it with all of our 21st century questions. This text is not seeking to answer all of those questions about the creation of the world, how everything's come together, how old the earth is. It's not going to answer those questions. It is the rap of a reawakened Hebrew. I threw that word rap in there. It's one of the only psalms that describes itself as a song and a poem. In my head from the 90s, that's rap. It might not well be rap in here, but it's certainly not a science book. It's the melody and the heart of somebody who is looking at God and seeing that there is more to their creation. That's what this psalm is, I think. We see as we go through the psalm, in fact, we see this over and over again with God's people. They've forgotten God. We see that they've forgotten God, and this is that moment. This psalm describes that moment of almost melancholy, holistic reflection as the poet looks at creation and thinks about the processes that's involved, thinks about the agriculture, thinks about nature, and he sees that it's not just about fate that you get your food, it's not just about how hard that you're willing to work, it's not whether you can copy the neighboring nations. It's about a designer and a design. I'll read it through with you, 9 to 13. You care for the land and water it. You enrich it abundantly. The streams of God are filled with water to provide the corn, to provide people with corn. For so you have ordained it. You drench its furrows and level its ridges. You soften it with showers and bless its crops. You crown the year with your bounty, and your carts overflow with abundance. The grasslands of the wilderness overflow. The hills are clothed with gladness. The meadows are covered with flocks. The valleys are mantled with grain. They shout for joy and sing. Do you see how it opens up? Do you see the picture that opens up before us here? They notice the agricultural pattern, and they look at it, and they don't just see hard work and graft and luck. They see the hand of a designer. There's too much care in it. There's too much love in it. There's too much provision in it. It's too nice. It's too beautiful. It's too giving. There's water that comes out of the sky. The water just falls down out of the sky, verse 9. It's channeled. I don't know if you've ever had the privilege of seeing the start of a river, seeing the water come down off the mountain and make its way down the hills. There's a beautiful provision about that. The soil gets enriched. The land is better. The food pops. I don't know if you've got a little allotment or anything like that, but to see the food, I've got a few failed efforts. The food pops out of the ground. And it's enough. Maybe this group of people have been a bit skeptical about whether the harvest would come. And the harvest comes round again, and they see that it's enough. One of the things I think we know as human beings, even though we scramble for food, is that if we would only share it, there's enough. In fact, week after week, if you're anything like me, we throw loads of it away. There is a bounty. Verse 12, even where you think it should be barren, the grasslands of the wilderness overflow. Even where you think there should be nothing, there is an abundance, there is a picture. It isn't just a useful thing. It looks beautiful. The meadows, verse 13, the meadows are covered with flocks, and the valleys are mantled with grain. They shout for joy and sing. I remember an old Glassdoor clip of Damon Albarn as he looked at the crowd. Damon Albarn's from a 90s band called Blur. They're still going. He looked at the crowd all waving, and he said, "You're like a field of corn." And he said that because he recognized a beautiful thing. God's provision is such that it's not just useful for us to eat, actually, and you'll know this, when you look out at a full field, it is an incredibly beautiful thing. And the people recognize in this moment that God did this. Do you see the repeated word in the text? You did this. They see the thing that they've forgotten, the hand of the Creator, the person who made the chaos, made sense of the chaos, who gave the food. God did this. You're going to just let me have that? I describe a field and we say that God does this. In the back of your mind should be the fact that crops fail. There are some tragic scenes across the world. And are we going to base our whole belief on God just on the fact that there's a nice picture of crops? The food is unequally shared as we dish it out. Some people get nothing. Some people are starving right now. We're going to say that there's a God that we can look at and bring this provision based on that. That's a compelling argument, isn't it? It stops us in our tracks. And yet, it's completely in line with the Bible pattern. We live in a fallen world. The Bible's really clear from the get-go. There is a problem with this. There's a cursed sense to the ground. And in that sense, when we look around, we ache with the story because it doesn't diminish our faith. It only reinforces the faith that we have. And what it definitely doesn't do is hide the Creator. We know this. When even Richard Dawkins can look on and talk about the hallmarks of a Creator with all his skepticism, we know as we look around us, we know that there is not just Christians who look around the earth and feel the sense of provision, feel like there's something more. This psalm reminds us of that sense. He's behind it all. It changes things. If you can just believe that, if you live by that God is behind the creation, everything that we have has God's hand on it, it changes things. One of the things that Jesus says is that it reassures us. I'm thankful to my Savior who talks a lot about worry. I have the odd moment of worry, and Jesus speaks into that. It's in Matthew 6:25. I don't think we have that text up, but I'll read it out for you. He's talking about how the knowing that God is behind the creation can really change things for us. Here's what he says: "Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life." Who gets to say that? What you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. Look at the creation. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Jesus says, look at the creation. Look at the creation and know that God made it. See the birds. See the birds. I think there's another passage that talks about that they're not worth anything. They're not worth 2 bob. They've got no pension pot, these birds. They've got no life plan. They've got no strategy, really, and yet look at the way they are provided for. Jesus says to us, if God is behind the whole of creation and he has this plan for them, how much more of a plan has he got for you? God is behind it all. If God is behind it all, if we believe that, like we live in a world that's got cause to give you anxiety. When you're somebody like me who every now and again will suffer with that, we live in a world that's got real cause for that to be a problem every now and again. And yet Jesus says to us in this moment, if we really believe that God is behind all of this, if he's the orchestrator, if he holds it together, if it's his plan, and we know because of Jesus that it's a good plan, then it's going to be all right. It's going to be all right. Jesus is saying us, we can be reassured. If God is behind it, it's going to be all right. This is the first thing that we see. God's behind it, it's reassuring. The second thing that we see is that And it's verses 5 through to 8. If we could possibly show them, that would be great. There's something awesome and right to see in it. God is in front of it. God is in front of it. There's something beautiful about it, and it is compelling. Verse 5 would tell us again that God is speaking to us. Do you see the first word or the second word? It's an answer. God is speaking to us. The creation, in terms of my theology, I don't think it's all of the answers. I think God's going to build on the answer, but it's certainly part of the conversation of faith. God speaks to us through his creation, and he gives us, in this next little bit, 2 scenes from nature. I think it's on your questions if you're kids. 2 scenes from nature to convince us, or that are transcendent scenes that show us God. So the psalmist writes, as he looks out on the creation, when I see this, I see that there's a God. I don't know if you've watched Gone Fishing. It's a show, again, for people of my age. It's about 2 guys who suffer with heart conditions. I don't yet have a heart condition, but it's about 2 guys who suffer with heart conditions, and they go fishing as a kind of a remedy. Bob Mortimer and Paul Whitehouse. Very, very funny. They find themselves on the sea bank, and they look down the stream often. The river's rippling. The sun is breaking through. There's some animals off in the distance. There's hills and there's mountains. And they say to each other, look, this is a window into heaven. And the cinematography is really good on the show, and they really work hard at it. And they say to each other, this is a window into heaven. And they go on, they break off from their fishing, and they end up talking about the bigger things of life. It's often what happens, isn't it, when we look at creation. I was stargazing, I mentioned it already with my girls last night, and we couldn't really have a normal, mundane, day-to-day conversation when you're looking at the stars. It opens up the world. It causes us to look up, doesn't it? The first of the 2 scenes that I want to draw our eyes to is in verse 8. It's a sunrise and a sunset. I think as I read through the text, that's what I think the picture is. The whole earth is filled with awe at your wonders. Everybody gets to see the sunset and the sunrise. It's not for the rich. Where morning dawns, where evening fades, you call forth songs of joy. What happens to you when you see a sunset? What happens to me is what happens, not always on a very grand scale, but on a minute scale in that verse 8. The whole earth is filled with awe at your wonders, where morning dawns and evening fades, you call forth songs of joy. Whenever I see a sunset, it never doesn't happen that I'm not captured, even if it's just for a second. Do you get that? It always stops me. It always steals a little bit of my heart. It gives me a little bit of hope that the world's still going round. There's a little bit of wonder. It always catches me, and I don't know if it's just a Yorkshire thing or a middle-aged man thing, I always declare it when I see it. I'll text somebody about it. If I see a gorgeous sunset, I'll put it on our family WhatsApp. Or I'll just say it out loud to myself. Would you look like an old man? Would you look at that? That's what I do. But we do it, don't we? We declare it. We voice it. We do exactly, even on a minute scale, what verse 8 is saying. We're taken to a place of worship. Even if it's just for a second, we are lost a little bit in wonder. And we become part of this song. Do you see where it goes, this song? This creation, do you see how far it reaches? It doesn't just stop with us. It reaches to the ends of the earth. Everybody gets to see this. Everybody gets to be caught in this wonder. This isn't just exclusively for God's people. It's not exclusively for us. The whole world gets dragged into wonder about this. God's people in this psalm see his wonders and they see God. That's the first picture that we get. The second picture that I'd want to draw our eyes to is in verse 6 and 7. It's when we see nature as both powerful and gentle all at the same time. Have you had any experience of that? When we see the strength and the power of the natural world, and then in the same breath, almost, it's all calm and it's all still. That's what it's saying here in verse 6. Who formed, and verse 6 and 7, who formed the mountains by your power, having armed yourself with strength, who stilled the roaring seas, the roaring of their waves, and the turmoil of the nations. It's that picture. Maybe you've had this. I had it the other week when we were in the Lake District. We're looking up at the mountains, and from a position of faith, I'm just aware of the power and the power it would take to make that. Climbing up one of these mountains and the wind's blowing your hair off. You can't speak to the person near you, and you're aware of the power of creation. I've had a few experiences where I've been caught in the storms, and you were just completely undone. You're helpless against the power of creation. And then a couple of seconds later, you make your way down the mountain. The sun catches your face. You see the still of the water. And it's beautiful when you experience that. You're blown away for a second, and you're like, how can these things be? I remember last week looking across at Lake Derwentwater. There's a paddleboarder on the flattest lake ever, and I'm looking beyond him towards the mountain of Great Gable, where I got lost and experienced the worst of the weather. And both of those things were there, and it was a transcendent moment for me. I was like, wow. When God's people see that the earth is made with great strength, and the person behind that is made with great strength, and yet can act so gently, they see the divine. You going to let me have that? You going to let me away with saying that? Is that enough to convince you? I think if that was the whole story, if it was just nice views, no matter how strong the winds were or how gentle they could become, would it be enough to get us to God? If that was the end of the story, I don't know where it would leave me. But it's definitely part of the conversation. The Bible story goes on to fill in some gaps beautifully as the story floods out. My mind was taken to some of the storms that the disciples and Jesus were in. Jesus gets in the boat with the disciples, the storm's blowing a gale, everybody's terrified. Everybody's scared. The disciples are like, what? We've ruined, we've had it, this is our end. And Jesus gets up and he speaks to the wind and the waves, and everything becomes still. And what do the disciples do? Phew, that's great. No, they turn to Jesus and they say, who on earth is this? What is this? They recognize that something divine is happening. As the story fills out, creation points us to the strong that is used with gentleness. It's the same thing we see in Jesus. It's the same thing we see in the birth of Jesus, the judgment of Jesus, and the death of Jesus. It's why it's great news. We see Jesus come. We're aware in the stories of his authority. We're aware of the miraculous powers that he's got. We're aware of the strength that he's got. We're aware, as we read the stories, of what he could do. And yet, when it comes to the point of judgment, when it comes to his death, he shows the greatest strength in that he doesn't lift a finger. Like the mountains that can be stilled as the sea. Creation would point us to God. All of it points us to God. It screams out to us the name of Jesus so that we are without excuse. There's a reason that we search and we gawp and we awe at beauty. There's a reason that we chase it. It's because there is something worth chasing out there. It will ever be thus until we see Jesus, is my firm conviction. It compels us, creation, in its beauty, to look further for more beauty. What I would say to you is this: don't miss creation's call. Don't miss the earth when it speaks. If you're wondering about the faith, if you're wondering about the Christian faith, it might well be that a sunrise, daft as it sounds, is the beginning of a conversation for you. Don't overlook that conversation. When you're caught in awe at a sunrise, don't overlook that. God starts conversations like that. If you're drawn to worship as you see the sun going down and you can't quite believe how beautiful it is, don't just get your camera out and post it. Open up your heart. Give thanks to a God who shapes things like this. Last thing that we see in the text, and it's the first couple of verses, is that creation is a gift. It's a reminder of grace. We think of it all over the world, don't we? We think of everything pretty much as being ours. Creation's a gift. God gives it to us. And it's a gift to know that. Praise awaits you. We're going to come back to verse 1. It's the key of the whole psalm. It's the climactic point, I think, even though it's at the start. Praise awaits you, our God in Zion. To you, our vows will be fulfilled. We're going to get our acts together. We're going to sing and dance. We're going to do all that stuff. You who answer prayer, to you all the people will come. Here's a key verse. When we were overwhelmed by sins, you forgave us our transgressions. Blessed are those you choose and bring near to live in your courts. We are filled with the good things of your house, of your holy temple. This is the moment when they get it. This is the end of the reflection. They see the hand of God on everything around them. They'd forgotten him. I don't think I'm over reading the text to see that. They'd forgotten him. They'd forgotten that he provided the food. They'd forgotten that he had anything to do with the creation. They'd forgotten him altogether. They'd gone off, do you see that verse 3, I think, into sin. And they'd gone off into sin to the extent that they were overwhelmed by it. And if you can think about where that would leave you as a person, when you are at the point when sin has ruined you so much that you are overwhelmed with it. My thoughts on sin has probably changed over the last 5 or 6 years. I've always just thought of it really individually. Maybe it's the times I'm brought up in. I'm much more aware of it now as being this horrible flood that we all get caught up in. It can be incredibly ruinous. Not to exclude us from responsibility, just to say that sin hits over everything. We can see our world, I would hold, as being in different places overwhelmed by sin. Just ruined by greed, ruined by wrong view of sex, ruined by these kind of things, ruined by addictions, just holding it over us, just ruined in that way. And this, ruined to the extent that God's out of the picture, as I've said. And this is the really great news. This is why I want to preach. This is why I want to tell this story, because it's at this time. It's at the time that we completely ignore God, that we give ourselves over to the extent that we're starting to ruin it for ourselves, that we can't even see God. It's now. You see that verse 3? When we're overwhelmed by sin, it's at that point that he forgives us. It's at that point that he acts. We see it really clearly laid out on the cross. We need, don't we? If you're going to forgive somebody, if you're anything like me, you just need you need somebody to just show you a little bit of willing. Do you get that? When you need to forgive somebody, it's like, just show me a tiny bit. Just show me that you've learned. Give me a little look to say that you're a tiny bit sorry. Except, probably, and maybe you're the same with me in this as well, except for those that are our own. Maybe our kids or our family. For those people, we can go, do you know what? I'm just going to forgive you. My grace will extend far enough. Even though you look like if you got a little talk, just going to ruin the house again, I'm going to be able to forgive you. Jesus, God, loves us like this. He goes to the cross. There's no point where it looks like the world's going to turn back anytime soon. It just gets worse and worse. We see more and more of the dark side of people. I wonder if Jesus, in the back of his mind, I know that he wasn't, I'm just playing devil's advocate, was thinking, maybe if they just turn a little bit, I'll still go through with it. I'll forgive him. I'll do this act of forgiveness. He doesn't. It's at the height of man's evil that God acts to forgive. And that makes it a love story. And there's a penny drop moment for this group of people at the start of this psalm when they realize that this creation that they've taken for granted and this God behind it is a gift. Not only is it a gift to enjoy, it's a gift just that you get the gift. It's a gift that you understand that the gift is a gift. It's a gift for you to get that creation is something that God gives to us because it shapes us and changes us in a beautiful way. There's a designer behind your dinner. Isn't that great? There's an artist behind every vista, and one that loves you enough to wrestle for you and fight to save you. And the people say, this is what it means to be blessed. If I'm really honest, I'm a bit over the whole #blessed thing. I'm sure I'll get caught out with it and I'll do one on social media or something like that, but I'm a little bit past it. What does it mean to be blessed? Here's one I'd let you have. It's blessed. It's #full-on blessed. If you look back at creation and you see God behind it, and if you see God in front of it, And if you know that in the middle of it, even though you're making a mess of it, God is there too, loving you and saving you. That is what these people realize it is to be blessed. And the psalm starts, and for us ends, with this lovely refrain as the penny drops for the people of God. And they realize, isn't it great that we get to be here in the courts of this, where this is taught, where this is the way of things? Isn't that a blessing to us? Isn't that amazing? And the psalmist writes, praise awaits you, our God in Zion. David says, we've learned, God, we've learned our lesson, and the next time you come through here, you're not going to believe it. Actually, that's only half of what he's saying. If you dig around into the meaning of the word, it's much more beautiful than that. Praise awaits is the idea of silence. David says, we are silent until you get here. What is the highest point of praise, would you say? When are you praising the most? Is it when you're shouting and bawling? I would use the analogy of a goal at football. If you're ever lucky enough to go to a Leeds United game, actually, you won't see many goals at Leeds United games. Let's talk about Manchester United. You go to a Manchester United game, there's the moment where the ball hits the back of the net, everybody roars, but there's a moment before that where people's face go like this, and you go, oh, this might even be a goal. And it's just for a second, it's silent. It's the same thing when you see a beautiful sunset or something like that. You'll tell everybody about it, but for a second, you are completely stilled and you are completely silent. That is what David is talking about here. That is what God does to people. That is where they end up in worship. He will silence us. If we'd really seen God, and we see this as we see people experience God, particularly in the Old Testament, if we'd really seen God, we might not even sing. We might not even preach. We'd be like other people that had seen God. We wouldn't be able to get a word out. We would sit there in silent awe. Praise awaits you, our God in Zion. It's a heck of a challenge to put over everybody, isn't it? Heck of a challenge to me. Is that how I feel about my God? Am I silenced? Do I look at his creation and always go straight to him and I'm silenced? Are you saying to yourself, Ash, I need to be honest, I'm not really in that place. Don't know if I've ever been in that place. Two things that I think the psalm is saying. First, I think David's saying we realize we should be. When he writes this, he's like, right, okay, next time you come through here, God, we're going to be on this. But more than we should be, because I think this is speaking prophetically into us, I think David is saying we will be. Not just we should be silent before God. I think David is saying to us, one day we will be. It's going to happen. If it's not happened for you yet, if you've not found yourself at that point of worship yet, then somewhere on your lifespan or into eternity, you will see God, you will see the Creator, and you won't get any words out for joy. The earth speaks. It does. It speaks of his Son. Will we listen?